In a battle of women versus technology, technology has won, and unfortunately, the SD card that contained all the footage of Albany Pass, the Torres Strait, Cape York, Thursday Island, the passage to Gove, and Gove itself has all been corrupted. I gave the SD card to a data recovery guy in Darwin, and he recovered a bunch of footage, but unfortunately almost none of it is from that time period. When I initially went through it, there was a lot of sailing footage and I couldn't tell what was what. And I was hoping that some of it was from the Torres Strait, but as I went through and edited all the footage, I started recognizing what was left as stuff that I'd already edited. I'm going to tell you the tale of the Torres Strait as best I can, because I think it's a really cool part of my journey. And to be honest, I was pretty devastated when I discovered that I'd lost all that footage. I think for those of you who are following along with my travels chronologically, it's a very nice, important piece of the puzzle. So I'm just going to give you a summary of what it was so that we can all move on. And I honestly have been dreading editing this episode for a really long time because it's upsetting. But here we are, so I'm gonna do it. When Dan and I left for Albany Pass, as those of you who watched that episode remember, I had not actually done any research into the tides of the Torres Strait. But luckily, when we were on Restitution Island, we met a very lovely couple who was caretaking, and they had internet that they let us use so that I could look up the tide tables and figure out exactly what we needed. Now, the Torres Strait has a pretty nasty reputation, but what I've found as I sail around the world is that every part of the world that you go to has a section of ocean that everyone talks about as being insanely gnarly, and there's all these horror stories about it, and it's hyped. Like, the first one was when I was in the waterway. So I was on my way to Beaufort, North Carolina from Virginia, and I forget, there was some section that was like 50 miles long of really shallow, kind of exposed water that I had to cross, and people were telling me about square waves and the wind picks up and it's really insane and gnarly, and I was like, whoa, what? And I had an awesome passage.
It's my hard-working little babe.
And then people talked about the Gulf Stream being horrible, and I did have a horrible time in the Gulf Stream. I got stuck in 45-knot winds and had to heave to, and that was like my first big passage, so that one did kind of live up to its reputation, but it was totally my fault because I didn't check the weather before I left because I didn't know how to. I kind of thought you just leave, and so I did, but what I did was leave into a 45-knot easterly trying to go east. So that one's totally on me.
I slept in 20-minute increments that night, getting up every so often to look for ships and check for weather. I could tell that the wind was increasing, but I really didn't want to do any sail changes in the dark that first day out. So I waited until sunrise and then suited up.
Yeah, it's doing great. Windy is doing great. Still in the Gulf, hard to cross, I have headwinds.
Little did I know, I was about to have one of the worst nights of my life. The whole Gulf Stream experience was pretty hellacious, but I guess I was just blissfully unaware at that point of what was about to come for the next week, really. I watched the winds slowly pick up from 20 to 25, and then gusts to 30, and then blowing a steady 25, gusting upwards into the low 30s. The waves were also picking up. They went from pretty little seas. They started building to about 8 to 10 footers by probably noon. It was sometime at about this point that I started to realize that I wasn't actually getting anywhere. It seemed like I was sailing really fast, but in fact, I was just sailing in place, barely. So the sun just set. It's blowing a steady 40 outside right now, and I have just hove to All I have up is my tiny storm jib. I struck the main. The waves are probably about 15 feet right now. I can't get out of the Gulf Stream. The wind is blowing from the due east. If I try to go on a southeast tack, I get pushed backwards west. If I try to go on a northeast tack, I just get pushed due north at almost 8 knots. I'm getting pushed slowly northwest at about 1.5 knots. I'm already halfway to Cape Hatteras, but I don't think that I'm gonna end up on the shore there because the Gulf Stream is too strong. It's just gonna push me north.
The next one people always talk about is the passage over the top of Colombia when you're on your way to Panama as being gnarly. There was a lot of lightning, but I don't think it was that gnarly. Here comes the rain. And that was just the beginning. Things were about to get much, much windier and more intense in about 30 seconds. Ah! Wow, this is crazy. This is fucked up, but also kind of cool. I just did my final deck check before I sat down for my naps for the night. This is one of my favorite games to play. It's called Where the Fuck Is That Noise Coming From? Na 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 na, wish I wasn't there. There's a large downpour right now. The squall is just unleashing. The lunch squall is pretty nasty. Well, I did hope for a good night. Instead, I ended up napping in the cockpit in a wet foul weather jacket in between squalls waiting for the next one to hit. It's about 4 in the morning and I'm in the cockpit again watching this big squall come towards me. It started out just looking like a regular squall, but it's starting to shape up to be a real lightning, crazy storm. The breaker is off. Hopefully my giant lightning pole sitting in the middle of an ocean doesn't get hit. People were completely freaked out about the sail from Fiji to New Zealand. That was when my sister visited me and we did that passage together. I didn't have an engine at the time and my mainsail ripped because it was so old that every time I flaked it, my fingers would poke holes through the sail. We got to Denarau, which was this marina that a lot of people were waiting to cross the passage in. And there were people who had been waiting for a month for the right weather window. Tiga and I stayed for about a week trying to get my engine fixed, realized that wasn't gonna happen. Then my visa expired, so I just left. And I did check the weather, but I also didn't really have a choice because I left the day I had to legally leave the country, and we ended up having an awesome passage. We got becalmed for 3 days. Without an engine, we couldn't motor, but we wouldn't have motored anyway. The Torres Strait has a bit more of a global reputation with sailors, but in my head I was thinking it's just another one of those bodies of water that people talk about. And what I've learned is that if you time it right and you wait for the right weather and the right current, you're likely gonna have a fine time. Albany Pass in the Torres Strait. We're going 8 knots right now with the current and wind behind us. It's dead flat. Eddies on both sides. It's only 0.3 nautical miles wide, so we're just kind of sandwiched between that is an eddy there and then that is one right there. So we're kind of just, more than looking at the chart, we're just looking at the current on the water. It's very cool. Albany Pass is a pass between the mainland and an island, and it's a cool shortcut, and if you get the time right, it's like stepping onto a conveyor belt. We timed it perfectly and ended up going about 8 to 9 knots in completely flat protected water for a couple miles. It definitely gave us an edge. I waited until the current was with us and the wind was with us. Those are the two most important things. And we had a breezy, dreamy little time getting up over the top of Cape York. We anchored in Pusan Bay, which has a really beautiful little campground. Stayed there for 2 nights. This is a little caravan park sitting area. This is a little bar. Last night they had wood-fired pizza. We had one, it was really delicious. And then they have a little gift shop, and that's the pool. And then the beach is just behind there, and Gek is back that way. It was a really rolly anchorage because it was blowing pretty hard. And then the next day we sailed up to Thursday Island, and that passage is part of the Torres Strait. But once again, I timed it and I waited for wind and current to be together, and we saw about 2 knots of current with us. The tide tables were a bit confusing to figure out, but basically I tried to time it so that we were right around slack tide. As tempting as it is to have a strong amount of current with you, it's always a safer bet to have a slack tide. And while I say, you know, I'm not allowing the hype to get in my head, obviously I'm still respecting the fact that I'm sailing my 27-foot boat through the Torres Strait with an engine that's capable of motoring about 2.5 knots. So I'm not just gonna like go in guns firing, not concerned about anything. Like, I was being careful. Thursday Island was really, really gorgeous. Super clear, crystal clear water. We did some exploring around the island on our BMX bikes. Stayed there for a couple days. We did a provision, but everything there is really expensive, so we just tried to get the bare minimum amount of freshies to get us to Gove. And then when we left Thursday Island, that was kind of the last push out of the Torres Strait, and honestly it was absolutely beautiful. Clear water, sunny skies. We were just slipping along over flat water at 8 knots, cruising out of there. It was so easy and nice. And the worst part of the passage to Gove, which is a 500-mile passage, was just this gulf that we had to sail through. It's pretty shallow. I think it's only like 100 or 200 feet the whole time. You're out of the Torres Strait, there's no current, but the waves just stack up in there. It was so rough. We had waves on the beam for 5 days. Both Dan and I got queasy. It was kind of one of those passages where you just grit your teeth and lie down and try to get through it, but it was just not very fun. It was probably blowing about 25 knots the whole time, too rough to be in the cockpit because we were taking waves, and intense enough that I couldn't ever really chill because I never knew it was squally, and probably one of my least favorite passages, I would say, although we did catch 2 tuna. We had 2 lines out with different lures on them. The only time we've caught a fish up the entire Great Barrier Reef coast. We caught them both at the same time. And then we got to Gove. So we are anchored half a mile from the yacht club because we can be. All these boats are on moorings, every single one, and I could have anchored closer because there's a lot of gaps between the moorings, but I kind of like it out here. It's nice, it's a little bit quieter, a little bit more privacy, and with Grub now we can make these distances in no time at all, so I'd always rather anchor further out and just have it be a bit quieter. So it's probably just a 5-minute dinghy ride or something in. And when I was a baby, my parents were sailing around the world in their 25-foot boat, and they spent a cyclone season in Gove. So I have all these old photos of Direction, which is the boat my parents sailed on, and my brother and my parents and I in Gove. So I recreated a lot of those photos. Most of them I recreated on the GoPro with the lost footage. But I think I have some that I took on my phone. But there was this overpass that my parents used to hitchhike from. So if you walk out of the Gove Yacht Club and down the road a ways, there's a factory, and it has this factory chute that goes over the road, so you can stand in a thin patch of shade, and my mom said that's where they always used to stand to hitchhike. So when we got to Gove, I decided to go into town to buy us some groceries, and I found that overpass and stood in the shade and hitchhiked and got a ride into town, and it was a very cool moment because I had all these pictures that I was kind of lining up myself with of these places I'd been as a baby. And there's a spot where you can get water where my parents actually brought their whole sailboat to. It's a little careening post because of the huge tides there. I just brought the dinghy there, but it has water on it. So I was able to fill the jerrys with water from the same place that my parents had brought their sailboat to fill it with water. Gove was cool because of how red and dusty it was. It really felt like deep Australia, and every morning I'd clean off the solar panels and wipe them with my hand, and my hand would be red from the dust. The sails were starting to get red, which is cool because I've always wanted red sails. It was hot, it was flat, the sunsets were insane. I think because of all the red dust in the air, it just amplified the beautiful sunsetty colors. I think we spent about a week in Gove. It was a really, really nice flat anchorage. Just kind of recovering from the passage and from a really intense trip up the Great Barrier, where it was usually blowing 30 to 35, and we were just either getting pounded by the wind and the waves out at sea or getting rolled silly in the anchorages. So it was our first spot we'd been where we could really chill and take a beat, and it was super nice. And I felt this tie to it because of my family history with it. It actually took us 2 tries to leave Gove. I got the currents, I think I got the currents wrong by a couple hours, and there are crazy currents coming in and out of Gove. So our first time we tried to leave, we had to make a certain speed to get to the next anchorage before dark, and we had current against us, and we just were not making more than about 2.5 knots, which was going to put us through the first pass, which isn't really a big deal, but not something I wanted to do at night, right around sunset, and then getting into the anchorage at night, which I'm just not interested in doing. So it's not very often on Gek that I go out and have to turn around, but it is known to happen. So this was one of the cases where we were out for a couple hours. It was pretty snarly conditions at sea anyway, and after about 3 hours, a hand steering in the sun, in the chop, I was like, you know what, we're not going to make it with the right, we need to leave way earlier to time the tide right. So we turned around, and then it was way easier to hand steer all the way back into Gove. The currents around there are absolutely wild, and notoriously, I've never been good at checking currents. I remember when I was sailing from Maine to North Carolina, I went down Long Island Sound. I didn't want to. At that point, I was really excited about being at sea because everything was new and fresh, and I just wanted to go out to sea and be out there having that experience. But it was November in the Northeast, and the winter storms were coming in, and there was a storm blowing 55 knots offshore. So the only way I was going to be able to make miles was to do the Long Island Sound. And when I was getting to the very bottom of the sound, there's Hell's Gate.
I'm going through Hell's Gate right now. Woo! How exciting!
Which is basically you sail next to Manhattan. Like, it's really cool. I went under the Brooklyn Bridge, past the Statue of Liberty, but Hell's Gate is this really narrow area full of really strong current, and I got the currents completely backwards. So when I left, I was like, no one else is leaving today. That's interesting. And it took me 45 minutes to get under the Brooklyn Bridge because there was so much current. I was just motoring as hard as I could. But the cool thing is that sailing next to Manhattan is just an insane experience. You have all the sounds of the city, the taxis, the pedestrians, the honking of the horns, but you're on your safe little boat. And one of my all-time favorite books is A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, and she always talks about the Brooklyn Bridge, and I'd never seen it before, so I was like, well, I just get an extra 45 minutes to stare at the Brooklyn Bridge.
God, I hate rush hour so much. Oh wait, I'm on a boat.
So this experience of getting the currents wrong wasn't really anything new. But anyway, that is my tale of the Torres Strait. I'm really sorry to you guys that the footage is destroyed, and I'm really sorry for me that the footage is destroyed, because it's one of those moments that you're only probably ever going to do once. But as Dan pointed out, ultimately I'm doing this experience for myself to be able to have these things, and I'm never going to forget those memories. And I have the 4 photos on my phone that I took of the Torres Strait. So the tales live on. It's not that long ago that there weren't GoPros and easy to use cameras, and sailors just had their stories to tell. And this is just one of those times that I tell the tale, and luckily nothing gnarly and exciting happened, otherwise you guys totally wouldn't believe me. So anyway, I'll see you next week with the passage through the hole in the wall, which is a really exciting passage. Patrons, you guys have seen that snack, but the YouTube version will be a lot more fleshed out with some other details. And then our next stop is Darwin, the huge crazy tides there, all of the wildland fires that we dealt with, and lots of crocodiles. So thanks for watching this week's placeholder episode. I put out new episodes on YouTube every 2 weeks, and for my patrons, you guys get a snack on the weeks that I don't put out a full-length YouTube video. If you'd like to become a patron, my Patreon is patreon.com/windhippie. And for one-time donations, I have a PayPal, paypal.me/windhippie, and merchandise all in the links below. Thank you everyone for your comments, and I hope this was enough. Yeah, I don't know. It's a very different format, but I wasn't really sure how else to tell the story, so this is what you get. So that is all. I'm excited for the next episode where I'm editing real video footage again.